excuse me, $2. That's all you put there. I think a lot of people, the principal, would buy that. And they would say, okay, this is the equivalent of $2. It's not a hot dog afterwards.
Well, and that's been the experience of coffee, right? People will pay, of course, it's a cheaper good, relative.
I don't know, do you want to pound coffee at Starbucks lately? I mean, it's
No, not Starbucks, more expensive places, but.
Starbucks doesn't tell you how much that extra is going to the workers.
Well, and that's an interesting
But other fair
aspect.
trade places do.
Right, I mean, how much do you advertise? I mean, you don't even necessarily have to label. If universities require the licensing contract that this be done by all licensees, then everyone ultimately is going to have to be raising their wholesale prices to some degree. That then translates into higher retail prices across the board. Then the only question is, are consumers going to stop buying the product? Because the $60 sweatshirt is now $65. I think it's highly unlikely that that would happen. But if you label, then you're talking about a whole other element of value add. It's a different product now. And of course, one thing we know very much about consumers of apparel is that people will pay extraordinary premiums to get something entirely intangible in an apparel product. 2 or 3 times the price they have to pay just to get that label. And so we understand, we know consumers will do that. And the question is, if they're willing to pay 100% more to get a Tommy Hilfiger or Calvin Klein or Donna Karan label, are they willing to pay, let's say it's 20%, they're willing to pay 20% more to feel good about the fact that the product wasn't made in a sweatshop? I think logic and experience dictates yes. And your colleague, Professor Dixon's research certainly shows that to be the case.
It's actually very much the same with food commodities. One thing that we are just starting to learn about is, how this plays out in products that aren't really quality differentiated. So fair trade oranges, and I will contrast that with fair trade coffees, teas, chocolates, which primarily, though now not fully, are sold to specialty buyers who are already going for particular taste characteristics and already expecting to pay a fairly high price. But recent research, such as what you presented last night, shows that that can work.
Yeah, just to try to understand a little bit, back to the example of if licensees build high-priced into the amount that they're paying the factories for the product. Doesn't that assume, though, that it's a factory that is producing all or substantially only collegiate coffee? In other words, the reality is that everyone using that factory would have to fall in line in terms of paying that additional wage, because otherwise you've got different consumers paying different price for the goods, and how does that directly translate into that?
This is another problem, absolutely, the structure of global apparel production. It's not true in footwear, but in apparel, most factories have multiple customers. It's rare for a brand to represent more than 15 or 20%, 25%, maybe 30% most of a particular factory's output. It happens. I mean, every brand has a small number of factories where they're 70, 80, 90% of the business, but most commonly it's substantially less than that. And so you do run into a mathematical problem. If a 10% price premium or a 20% price premium at the factory door is supposed to translate into a much higher wage for the whole workforce, and only one customer representing 20% of the business is willing to pay the premium, you've got a problem. Now, there are 2 ways to solve that. 3 ways. One is that customer pays an even higher premium and in effect subsidizes the other buyers. Another way is that you consolidate production. Another way is you get all of the buyers to pay the premium. Now, ultimately, that's the goal, right? You want all of the buyers to pay the premium. But if you don't have that, and if you don't expect a single buyer to pay 100% premium so as to subsidize their competitors who are using the same factory, you have to consolidate production. And we propose that in a university context, that for those products where it can be done, and we believe it's 90% of what's sold as university logo apparel that can be done, that there should simply be a consolidation of university logo apparel production into a small enough number of factories that those factories are producing primarily for this market. And there are other advantages, indeed, arguably, other reasons why it's necessary to do that. The main one being accountability. If you have a factory that's producing 20% for Nike or Adidas, and Nike or Adidas is hewing to a higher standard, whether because they've chosen to do so themselves or universities have required it, and the rest of the factory's production is for Walmart and Target and some other cut-rate retailer brand, which retailers, which brands, which customers' priorities and preferences are going to determine the working conditions, the priorities of management. And so it's critically important if institutions like universities expect factories to adhere to their labor standards, to have factories that are primarily accountable to their labor standards, not to Walmart standards or Target standards. Now, brands have told us, Bruce, that there are additional cost increases, and that's why I threw a couple other percent in. Cost increases potentially associated with that consolidation. And there are certainly sacrifices that entails. I mean, there's a reason why production is structured that way. It has partly to do with flexibility. It has partly to do with brands not wanting to have too much responsibility for any one factory. And so there may be delivery deadlines may have to be pushed back. There might be a modest reduction in the variety of product available, and these are trade-offs that may have to be made. And my point of view is, if the sacrifice that is necessary to eliminate sweatshop conditions and enable workers who make the apparel wear to have decent wages and families have a decent life, is that we will have 6 choices of UW logo sweatshirts instead of 8. I mean, that's a moral choice we have to make. My hope is that most people would settle for the 6 sweatshirts. And the market will decide which 6. So yeah, there are, and Bruce is exactly right, there are other structural changes that need to happen, there are other costs. It could result in higher increases for certain products. You might have to exempt certain products that just can't be produced in that way, which would be fine if you're talking about a modest percentage of the overall piece. So it is more complicated than that. I mean, the whole structure of global apparel supply chains was developed at a time when labor issues were not a concern of the brands and retailers. It was not on the radar screen. And so the structure itself reflects the priorities that existed at the time the structure was developed, which were 3 things: quality, high quality, fast delivery, and low price. Now it stands to reason that when we introduce a 4th goal, a 4th priority, that a structure that was developed when that priority didn't matter is going to have to undergo some modifications in order to accommodate that new priority.
Oh, well, yeah, thank you. I totally agree that, well, I just want to say first of all that sometimes we overlook in this debate that consumers are really the elephant in the room. Sometimes we overlook the fact that consumers are the elephant in the room here in our fashion demands and need or perceived need for lots and lots of new and different clothing. But I'm also seeing an issue, say you've got the consolidated fair trade certified factories, and then right next door you've got the Walmart factory. What's that going to do for social inequality? And how can you avoid creating a situation of haves and have-nots, so increase social inequality in these producing communities?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's hard to increase the level of social inequality in most of the countries that we're talking about. Yeah, I mean, exactly how that plays out, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an important question. I certainly don't think we want to not do it because we assume it will cause some unspecified set of problems. I think it's something that has to be monitored, and it's something ultimately, obviously, people who live in those communities and workers need to resolve for themselves. People also argue that workers will be paying huge bribes to get jobs at these factories, and that's where you get back to the monitoring process. I mean, the fact that you require a price premium does not mean the factory, unmonitored, is suddenly going to do everything it's supposed to be doing. The factory, given an opportunity to cheat, some of them will cheat, so you still have to monitor very aggressively to make sure bribes aren't being charged and so forth. The huge difference is if you're monitoring in a circumstance where the factory has both the financial incentive and the wherewithal to meet the standard, it's a lot easier than if you're monitoring a situation where every economic incentive tells the factory not to comply. I mean, it's an interesting
It
question.
could work the other way, too.
Yeah.
You could put pressure.
You hope that will happen.
Yeah.
So actually, after going on what Ms. Linton said, doesn't fair trade stuff do that as well? Can it also increase social inequality? Because you have plantations, which is what most of coffee production is, and then you have these small co-ops that people produce. And then I also have kind of a follow-up to Mr. Novak